The sound of the dimensional biwa did not merely stop. It shattered into a discordant scream that fractured the gravity of the Infinity Castle. Nakimi, the demon who held the fortress of the Demon King in the palm of her hand, stared at her fingers. They were not broken, but they had turned into rubbery, elongated tendrils that refused to pluck the strings of reality. The infinite wooden expanse of Muzan Kibutsuji's stronghold was no longer obeying the Euclidean laws of sliding doors and inverted staircases. Instead, the wood was breathing. The tatami mats were undulating like a storm-tossed ocean, and the lanterns that illuminated the eternal night of the demon's sanctuary had transformed into floating, leering eyes that blinked in synchronized mockery. This was not an attack by the Demon Slayer core. It was not the precise, breathless violence of a Hashira. It was a cancer of reality, a sudden and violent rewriting of the physical laws that governed the separation between matter and void. In the center of the chaotic twisting architecture, upper rank 3, Akaza, stood poised in his destructive stance, his compass needle deployed to detect battle spirit. Yet his senses were screaming in a way they never had in centuries of combat. He could not detect a fighting spirit because the entity before him did not possess anything resembling a spirit. It possessed only a manic, radioactive exuberance that felt like the pressure of a collapsing star compressed into a human shape. Akaza threw a punch capable of obliterating a ribcage, a blow that moved faster than the eye could track, intended to splatter the green-faced intruder against the warping walls. The fist connected. There was no crunch of bone. There was no splatter of blood. The green-headed figure simply deformed around the fist, its body stretching like warm taffy, absorbing the kinetic energy of a demon capable of killing hundreds and converting it into a kinetic bounce. The intruder spun. The momentum of Akaza's killstroke redirected, and the demon was launched backward not by force, but by a sudden, violent rejection of inertia. Muzan Kibutsuji watched from the inverted ceiling, his cells vibrating with a sensation he had not felt since the days of Yoriichi Tsugikuni. It was fear, but it was not the fear of death. It was the fear of irrelevance. The creature below wore a suit of impossible yellow fabric, a color so vibrant it seemed to burn a hole in the retinas of the demons accustomed to the dark. It moved with a frame rate that did not match the rest of the world, a blur of motion that left after images lingering in the air like radioactive ghosts. This was not a blood demon art. Muzan knew every drop of blood he had ever distributed, and this chaos belonged to no lineage of his making. The air smelled of gunpowder and ozone and cheap cologne, a sensory assault that drowned out the scent of wisteria or blood. The figure reached into a pocket that physically could not exist and withdrew a mallet the size of a carriage. The logic of the weapon was undeniable and impossible simultaneously. It cast a shadow over Akaza, who looked up, his martial perfection rendered obsolete by a tool of blunt, impossible comedy that carried the weight of a mountain. The reality of the Taisho era groaned under the strain. The boundaries between the spirit world and the physical world were being erased, not by spiritual enlightenment, but by the sheer brute force of a reality warper that recognized no authority. The demon slayer marks, the breathing styles, the carefully cultivated hierarchy of the 12 Kazuki. All of it was suddenly fragile in the face of this new, chaotic variable. The mask had not just arrived in Japan. It had assaulted the genre itself, demanding that the tragic, somber physics of the demon world bend to the manic elasticity of a cartoon god. As the mallet descended, the air pressure collapsed, shattering the sliding doors for miles in every direction. and the scream of the Infinity Castle was drowned out by a sound far more terrifying than any death rattle. A laugh. A howling, synthetic, impossible laugh that signaled the end of order and the beginning of a nightmare painted in neon green. The ejection from the Infinity Castle was not a tactical retreat, but a biological purging. The dimensional fortress vomiting out the foreign contaminant that threatened to unravel its metaphysical architecture. Nakimi, pushed to the brink of cognitive collapse by the sheer, non-Euclidean nonsense of the intruder, slammed the doors of her biwa with a desperate finality that severed the spatial link. The green-faced entity did not fall. He materialized in the skies above the glowing, modernized district of Asakusa, turning the descent into a theatrical skydive without a parachute. The air pressure around him did not crush him. It bowed to him. He plummeted toward the crowded streets of Taisho-era Tokyo, a neon comet screaming a hole through the somber atmosphere of a nation grappling with the tension between tradition and industrialization. Below him, the populace moved in the rhythmic flow of a city, waking to the electric night, unaware that the laws of physics governing their existence were about to be repealed by a chaotic god wearing a zoot suit. The impact crater was instantaneous but silent, a defiance of acoustic law, where the kinetic energy was absorbed by the pavement and converted into a massive, bouncy shudder that knocked pedestrians off their feet within a 3-block radius. Dust did not billow. It poofed into perfect rings that expanded and vanished with an audible pop. In the center of the distortion stood the entity, dusting off shoulders that seemed too broad for his skeletal structure. The crowd, a mix of late-night salarymen, geisha, and laborers, froze. In a world where demons lurked in the shadows and devoured human flesh with visceral, wet violence, this was an alien terror. The stranger's face was a rigid, glistening green mask of synthetic flesh, his teeth too large, too white, and too numerous, gleaming with a predatory luster that mocked the human skeletal structure. He did not smell of blood or rot, the telltale sense of the demonic predators that Tanjiro Kamado had spent years tracking. He smelled of sulfur, cheap cologne, and high explosives. A chemical bouquet that assaulted the nose and made the eyes water. A policeman, his hand trembling on the hilt of his saber, blew a whistle. The sound was thin and pathetic against the backdrop of the entity's presence. The mask turned, his neck twisting 180 degrees with the sound of a ratchet, his eyes bulging from their sockets like telescopic lenses to focus on the officer. The fear in the air was palpable, tasting of copper and bile, but the entity did not feed on it. He found it hilarious. With a flick of his wrist, the policeman's saber was replaced by a rubber chicken, the transformation occurring not through sleight of hand, but through a sudden, terrifying transmutation of matter. The steel simply ceased to be steel and became latex. The officer stared at the gag prop, his mind unable to comprehend the violation of material science. And in that moment of hesitation, the chaos began in earnest. Tanjiro Kamado, Zenitsu Agatsuma, and Inosuke Hashibira had been patrolling the outskirts of the district, following rumors of a lower moon's presence when the air pressure dropped. It was not the crushing aura of a powerful demon, which usually felt like stepping into freezing water or being buried alive. This sensation was more akin to vertigo, a sickening lurch in the inner ear that suggested the ground was no longer solid. Tanjiro stopped, his nose twitching violently. The scent thread he relied on to detect openings and enemies was fraying, splitting into 1,000 contradictory directions. It smelled like a celebration and a funeral simultaneously. It smelled like burning celluloid. Zenitsu clutched his head. his enhanced hearing picking up a cacophony that shouldn't exist, slide whistles, car horns, and a heartbeat that sounded like a bass drum kicked by a giant. It was loud, rhythmic, and overwhelmingly artificial. Inosuke, usually the first to charge, hesitated. His beast instincts, honed in the wild to detect predators and prey, were registering something that fit neither category. This was not an animal. It was a natural disaster that laughed. They ran toward the disturbance, the tile roofs passing beneath their feet as they navigated the verticality of the city. When they arrived at the intersection, the scene that greeted them defied the training of the Demon Slayer Corps. The street had been turned into a stage. The buildings on either side were bending rhythmically, the windows acting like eyes that blinked in time with the entity's movements. The mask was in the center, spinning like a tornado, a blur of yellow and green that tossed carts, rickshaws, and street lamps into the air where they juggled themselves. Civilians were not dying, but they were being subjected to a psychological torture of impossible physics. A man was flattened against a wall like a poster, his eyes blinking in two-dimensional terror, alive but geometrically compromised. Another was spinning like a top, unable to stop, his scream shifting in pitch like a Doppler effect. The violence was bloodless, but horrifyingly absolute. The permanence of the human body was being treated as a suggestion. Tanjiro drew his Nichirin blade, the black steel humming with the resolve of water breathing. He knew he had to act. He did not know what this creature was, but it was hurting people, twisting their bodies and their homes into a mockery of life. He took a breath, oxygen flooding his cells, his heart rate stabilizing into the rhythm of the water surface. First form, water surface, slash. He launched himself from the roof, a ribbon of blue water manifesting in his wake, a visual representation of his sword technique. The strike was true, aimed at the entity's neck, the universal weak point for demons. The blade connected. There was no resistance. There was no severance. The neck of the green-faced man simply stretched, elongating like warm dough, the head moving 5 feet to the left while the body remained stationary. Tanjiro's momentum carried him through the empty space where the neck should have been, and he landed in a crouch, turning instantly to reassess. The head snapped back onto the shoulders with a wet thwack. The entity looked at Tanjiro, its expression shifting from manic glee to mock surprise. It reached into its pocket and pulled out a magnifying glass the size of a shield, holding it up to Tanjiro. The Slayer saw his own reflection, distorted and tiny, before the entity blew a raspberry that generated a shockwave of wind, strong enough to knock the tiles off the adjacent roof. Inosuke screamed, his patience evaporated. If water wouldn't cut it, jagged teeth would. Beast breathing, fifth fang, crazy cutting. He launched himself into the air, his dual blade spinning. A whirlwind of serrated steel aimed at shredding the target into confetti. The mask yawned, his jaw dropping to the pavement, literally hitting the ground with a metallic clang. He stepped to the side, moving with a frame rate that skipped the intervening space, appearing instantly behind the boar-headed boy. As Inosuke landed, slashing at empty air, the mask reached out and grabbed the waistband of Inosuke's uniform. With a heave that defied leverage, he pulled the fabric up over Inosuke's head, trapping the beast-breathing user in his own clothes, binding his arms and legs in a chaotic knot of fabric. Inosuke thrashed, screaming muffled threats, rolling around on the ground like a chaotic tumbleweed. Zenitsu, trembling on the roof, watched with eyes wide with terror. He knew sound. He knew the sound of muscles tensing, of blood pumping, of breath drawing. This creature made no biological sounds. It made sound effects. Every step was a timpani hit. Every blink was a woodblock. It was a living cartoon, and to a coward who feared death, a thing that could not die was the ultimate nightmare. The terror overwhelmed him. His eyes rolled back. He fell asleep. The change in Zenitsu was instantaneous. The unconscious mastery took over. Thunder breathing, first form, thunderclap and flash. The air cracked. Zenitsu vanished. A streak of yellow lightning tearing across the street, moving at speeds that the human eye could not track. It was the fastest technique in the Slayer arsenal, a strike that decapitated demons before they heard the thunder. The blade approached the mask's neck. In that microsecond, the mask's face shifted. He didn't dodge. He opened his mouth and swallowed the sword. The lightning fizzled out. Zenitsu, still asleep, hung suspended in mid-air, his hand gripping the hilt of a blade that was now buried to the guard in the entity's gullet. The mask gulped, the shape of the sword visible as it traveled down his throat, bending at a right angle, before he patted his stomach and belched a small cloud of electricity. He plucked Zenitsu from the air and tossed him gently onto a pile of oversized, soft pillows that had materialized out of nowhere. The mastery of the thunder breathing had been nullified not by speed, but by a biological elasticity that absorbed the lethality of the strike. Tanjiro stood alone, his breath hitching. The logic of the battle was falling apart. Water flowed, thunder struck, beast tore. But this thing absorbed, deflected and mocked. He looked at the civilians. The flattened man was peeling himself off the wall, gasping for air, his ribs audibly popping back into 3 dimensions. They were alive. The creature wasn't killing them. It was playing with them. But the play was violent enough to destroy the city. Tanjiro tightened his grip. He needed to think. He needed to find the line of interval. He focused, the world slowing down as he entered the state of total concentration. He looked for the opening thread. He saw it. It wasn't at the neck. It wasn't at the heart. The thread led to the mask itself. The object. The face was fake. The wood or bone surface was the source. He had to remove it. But before Tanjiro could initiate his next form, the variables of the battlefield shifted again. The presence that Tanjiro had been tracking earlier, the lower moon, revealed itself. Drawn by the massive expenditure of energy and the chaos, lower rank 1, Enmu, emerged from the shadows of an alleyway. The demon looked confused. He had been preparing to put a train full of passengers to sleep, to harvest their dreams, but this disturbance was impossible to ignore. Enmu saw the green man, the battered slayers, and the warping reality. He smiled. To a demon who specialized in dreams and nightmares, this reality-warping power was enticing. If he could consume this entity, if he could take this blood, his standing with Muzan would skyrocket. He would transcend the lower ranks. He would become a god of dreams. Enmu raised his hand, the mouth on the back of it opening to whisper the incantation of his blood demon art. "Sleep," the mouth whispered. "Go to sleep and have a nightmare." The spell wave washed over the street. Tanjiro felt his eyelids heavy, the familiar pull of Enmu's magic. He bit his tongue, the pain sharpening his mind, forcing him awake. But the mask did not have a tongue to bite. The spell hit the green-faced entity square in the chest. The mask froze. He teetered. He fell backwards, stiff as a board, snoring with a sound like a chainsaw cutting through a log. Enmu laughed, a high, reedy sound. "It doesn't matter how strange you are," Enmu gloated, stepping forward, his flesh tentacles extending to consume the sleeping victim. "In the dream, I am the master. I will show you your greatest fear, and then I will eat your core." Enmu's flesh pierced the chest of the yellow-suited man. Inside the dreamscape of the mask, Enmu did not find the human subconscious. He did not find memories of family or loss. He found a void of neon-checkered floors and floating alarm clocks. He found a landscape where the sun wore sunglasses and the clouds were shaped like anvils. Enmu stood in the center of the dream, ready to craft a nightmare. But the atmosphere was hostile to his presence. The dream was not passive. It was aggressive. A giant version of the mask's head appeared in the sky, looking down at the demon invader. "You want a nightmare?" the voice boomed, echoing from every direction. "I'm not locked in here with you, pal. You're locked in here with me." In the physical world, the mask's body began to convulse. Not in pain, but in transformation. The flesh tentacles Enmu had inserted suddenly turned into snakes. Real, hissing, venomous cobras. Enmu screamed, retracting his limbs, but the transmutation traveled up the connection. The demon's arm turned into a long, rubbery hose. The infection of Toon physics was backtracing the link. Enmu panicked, severing his own arm, blood spraying across the pavement. But the blood didn't hit the ground. It turned into red confetti. The mask woke up, his eyes popping open with the sound of a cash register. "Morning already," he quipped, leaping to his feet. He looked at Enmu, the demon who had tried to violate his mind. The smile on the mask's face vanished, replaced by a row of shark-like teeth. The playfulness was gone. This was the predator realizing something else was trying to be the alpha. The mask reached into his pocket and pulled out a Tommy gun. But it wasn't a standard Taisho-era firearm. It was a massive, multi-barreled exaggeration of a gun, the kind that belonged on a propaganda poster. "Say hello to my little friend," he screamed. Enmu, terrified and missing an arm, tried to regenerate, but his cells were confused. They were trying to regenerate bone and muscle, but the local reality was demanding they regenerate as rubber and stuffing. The mask pulled the trigger. The gun didn't fire bullets. It fired boxing gloves. Hundreds of them. A stream of red leather fists pummeled the lower moon, driving him back against the brick wall of a warehouse. The force was kinetic and humiliating. Enmu's head was knocked back and forth like a speed bag. The demon, who had survived battles with pillars of the core, was being dismantled by slapstick violence. Tanjiro watched, his sword lowered. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution by absurdity. Enmu, battered and broken, tried to melt into the shadows to escape. The mask saw the attempt. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a vacuum cleaner. A simple household vacuum. He flipped the switch. The suction was not aerodynamic. It was metaphysical. It pulled the shadows. It pulled the darkness. And it pulled Enmu. The demon screamed as his liquid form was dragged through the air, his immortality meaningless against the suction of a device that ignored the laws of demon biology. With a final slurping pop, Enmu was sucked into the dust bag. The mask clicked the machine off, patted the canister, and then looked at Tanjiro. He winked. The silence that followed was heavy. The city block was a ruin of twisted architecture and confused physics. Inosuke was still struggling in his own clothes. Zenitsu was snoring on the pillows. Tanjiro stood facing the entity, his mind racing. The demon was gone, defeated in seconds by a power that made no sense, but the entity remained. And as Tanjiro looked into the white eyes of the mask, he realized the danger had not passed. The demon was a creature of order, of hierarchy, of biological rules. This thing was chaos, and chaos did not stop just because the bad guy was gone. The mask tapped his foot, checking an imaginary watch on his wrist. "Boring," he shouted. "Where's the big guy? Where's the music? Let's paint the town red." He spun, creating a whirlwind that began to strip the paint off the nearby buildings. sucking the color out of the world and leaving it gray, redistributing the pigment into a chaotic mural of graffiti on the sky itself. A Kasugai crow circled overhead, its eyes wide with avian panic. It did not call the usual orders. It screamed a single phrase over and over, relaying the message to the headquarters, to the master, to the Hashira. Reality breach, reality breach, Asakusa district lost. Summon the stone, summon the wind, reality breach. The bird's voice cracked, terror overriding its conditioning. Tanjiro gripped his sword. He could not leave. He could not let this chaos spread. Even if his water breathing was just a splash against a hurricane, he had to stand his ground. He stepped forward, raising his blade against the god of mischief. The mask stopped spinning. He looked at the boy with the checkered haori. He tilted his head, and then, slowly, a gleam of recognition crossed the synthetic face. Not of Tanjiro, but of the archetype, the hero, the straight man. The mask grinned. He had an audience, and the show was just beginning. The ground beneath Tanjiro turned to ice, and the boy slipped, his discipline failing against the frictionless surface. The mask laughed, a sound that echoed not just through Asakusa, but through the metaphysical layers of the world, alerting every sensor, every spirit, and every demon that the rules of the game had been permanently broken. The age of the sword was over. The age of the mallet had begun. The silence that followed the defeat of lower rank 1 was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the breathless void of a held breath. Tanjiro Kamado stood amidst the wreckage of Asakusa, his grip on his Nichirin blade white-knuckled, watching the entity in the yellow suit pat the dust bag of the vacuum cleaner like a satisfied housewife. The boy's instincts, usually sharp and clear, were clouded by a profound cognitive dissonance. The scent of the stranger was a chaotic swirl of ozone, gunpowder, and something ancient and deeply repressed, like the collective ID of humanity given form. It was not demonic, but it was undeniably dangerous. The mask, sensing the boy's scrutiny, turned and tipped his fedora, the hat lifting entirely off his head, along with a patch of green scalp, before snapping back into place. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit and withdrew a cigar the size of a baguette, lighting it with a flamethrower that materialized from his fingertip. The smoke he exhaled did not dissipate. It formed the words, "That's all, folks," in midair, before dissolving into a rain of soot. Tanjiro stepped back, shielding his nose. This creature mocked the very air the demon slayers relied upon for power. To breathe in his presence felt like inhaling anarchy. The fragile truce of confusion was shattered by the sound of tearing wind. It was not a natural gust, but the violent displacement of air caused by a body moving at the threshold of sound. Sanemi Shinazugawa, the wind Hashira, arrived with the force of a hurricane, his arrival preceded by a shockwave that cracked the already damaged pavement. He did not ask questions. He did not assess the situation. He saw a monster standing over a demon slayer, and he saw the destruction of a human city. His code was absolute. The enemy was to be obliterated. Sanemi launched himself from the roof of a 3-story building, his eyes wide with the manic intensity of a man who lived only to kill demons. Wind breathing, first form, dust whirlwind cutter. He became a cyclone of blades, a horizontal tornado aimed directly at the green head of the intruder. The speed was blinding, a testament to the peak of human physical conditioning and total concentration breathing. The blade struck the mask's neck with enough force to sever a boulder. The result was a sound like a wet balloon rubbing against glass. The blade did not cut. It sank into the green flesh, which stretched elastically around the steel. Sanemi's momentum was arrested instantly, his body jerking to a halt in midair as the mask's neck absorbed the kinetic energy. The entity looked down at the Hashira, his eyes popping out of their sockets on stalks to inspect the sword lodged in his throat. He reached up, grabbed the blade with a gloved hand, and pulled it out with a sickening squelch. The wound closed instantly, leaving not a scar but a zipper. The mask zipped his throat shut, then looked at Sanemi with mock indignation. He wagged a finger, his hand expanding to the size of a stop sign. Sanemi, fueled by adrenaline and rage, did not hesitate. He spun, slashing again and again. Second form, claws purifying wind. Vertical claws of wind tore through the space, shredding the yellow suit. But the suit regenerated as fast as it was destroyed, the fabric knitting itself together with cartoonish speed. The mask yawned, checking a pocket watch that spun wildly. He tapped Sanemi on the forehead. The tap sent the Hashira flying backward through 3 brick walls, the force of the blow disproportionate to the effort. Sanemi erupted from the rubble, blood trickling from his forehead, his Morechi blood scent filling the air. For a normal demon, this rare blood would be an intoxicant, causing them to lose focus. The mask sniffed the air, his nose growing 2 feet long and vibrating. He hovered off the ground, following the scent trail like a hound, floating over to Sanemi. He took a deep sniff, then pulled out a shaker of salt and a bib. The insult was profound. Sanemi screamed, his veins bulging, and unleashed the 9th form, Idaten Typhoon. He jumped into the air, raining down blows that decimated the street, turning the cobblestones into dust. The mask simply sidestepped, his body bending at impossible angles, his feet remaining planted while his torso weaved through the lethal currents of wind like a ribbon. He was dancing. To the Hashira, this was a battle for the survival of humanity. To the mask, this was the Mambo. The ground shook. A shadow fell over the chaotic duel. Gyome Himejima, the stone Hashira, had arrived. He landed with the weight of a mountain, his presence grounding the chaotic atmosphere. He was the strongest of the slayers, a giant of a man whose blindness allowed him to see the world through the vibrations of the earth. But what he felt now terrified him. The vibrations coming from the green entity were not consistent. They were jagged, erratic, and lacked the rhythm of a living thing. It felt as if the earth itself was recoiling from the stranger's footsteps. Gyome clasped his hands, the prayer beads clicking. He sensed the danger Sanemi was in. This was not a demon that could be cut. It was a force that needed to be crushed. Gyome swung his flail, the spiked iron ball generating a sonic boom as it tore through the air. Stone breathing, first form, serpentinite twin hydra. The weapon flew toward the mask, aimed to obliterate his skull. The mask saw the giant iron ball coming. He did not dodge. He opened his mouth, his jaw unhinged, dropping to the floor, his throat expanding into a cavernous tunnel. He swallowed the spiked flail whole. The chain went taut. Gyome, sensing the resistance, pulled back, his immense muscles straining. The mask pulled back, his heels digging trenches into the concrete. It was a tug of war between the strongest human in history and a living cartoon. The physics of the encounter began to warp. The chain stretched, the iron links elongating into oval shapes. The mask grinned around the chain in his mouth, muffled laughter bubbling up. He gave a sharp yank. Gyome, for the first time in his life, lost his footing. He was dragged forward, sliding toward the gaping maw of the entity. Sanemi, seeing the stone Hashira in danger, charged again, aiming for the mask's eyes. The mask spat. The iron flail launched from his mouth like a cannonball, covered in green slime. It struck Sanemi in mid-air, knocking the Hashira into the side of a tramcar with bone-shattering force. The tram derailed, sliding sideways into a storefront. The mask dusted off his hands. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a megaphone. He put it to his lips, and his voice amplified to a volume that shattered every window in a 10-block radius. "Is this the best you got? I ordered the special, but all I got was ham." The sonic wave flattened the demon slayers, who were arriving as reinforcements, blowing them down the street like dry leaves. Tanjiro, anchoring himself with his sword, felt his eardrums threaten to burst. The situation was escalating beyond any tactical solution. The Hashira were attacking with lethal intent, and the mask was retaliating with humiliating, reality-breaking force. But the true catastrophe was not the physical damage. It was the metaphysical contamination. As the mask exerted more power, the environment began to change permanently. The street lamps melted and reformed into sunflowers that sang barbershop quartets. The shadows cast by the buildings detached themselves and began to dance independently of the objects that cast them. The rigid laws of the Demon Slayer universe, the immutable facts of gravity, biology, and death, were being rewritten by a proximity to the mask's field of influence. This was the Toon World effect, a radioactive decay of logic. The breathing techniques of the Slayers relied on the precise manipulation of oxygen and blood flow, but the air in Asakusa was changing. It was becoming heavy, sweet, and thick, like inhaling cotton candy. Sanemi, pulling himself from the wreckage of the tram, coughed violently. He tried to perform a recovery breath to stitch his cracked ribs, but when he inhaled, his chest inflated like a balloon. He looked down in horror as his torso became perfectly round. He exhaled, and his voice came out high-pitched and squeaky, like he had inhaled helium. The horror on his face was absolute. His warrior's body, honed through years of torture and discipline, was being turned into a gag. He slashed at his own chest, trying to release the trapped air, but the blade bounced off his rubberized skin. The infection was spreading. The mask's power was not just external, it was colonizing their biology. Gyome stood up, his face grim. He sensed the corruption in Sanemi's physiology. He realized that engaging this creature physically was spreading the plague. He began to chant a sutra, focusing his stone breathing to harden his own body against the warping reality. But the mask was bored of the fighting. He wanted a finale. He looked at the devastation, at the broken tram, the twisted buildings, and the terrified slayers. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a paintbrush and a bucket of black paint. He painted a hole in the ground, a perfect black circle. But instead of remaining a drawing, it became a void, a deep, bottomless pit in the middle of the street. "Going down," the mask shouted. He grabbed the edge of the reality he stood on, the literal fabric of the asphalt, and pulled. The street wrinkled like a rug. The slayers lost their balance. The mask whipped the rug of the street, sending a ripple of earth toward the Hashira. Gyome slammed his axe down to stop the earth wave, but the ground turned to liquid beneath him. He sank to his waist in quicksand that smelled of bubblegum. Then the catastrophe occurred. In the chaos of the shifting earth and flying debris, the vacuum cleaner containing Enmu was crushed under a falling slab of masonry. The plastic canister shattered. The dust bag ripped. Enmu, or what was left of him, a slurry of demonic flesh and consciousness, leaked out. But he did not regenerate into a humanoid demon. He had been subjected to the vacuum, compressed, and saturated with the mask's chaotic energy inside the bag. The demon blood mixed with the residue of the mask's toon force. The result was a volatile, unholy fusion of biological malice and reality warping. The slurry bubbled. It rose, not as flesh, but as ink. Dark living ink that pulsed with a heartbeat. It formed a shape, a towering ink blot demon that resembled Enmu but twisted into a caricature. Its eyes were swirling hypno-discs. Its mouth was a jagged zipper. The creature screamed, a sound that was a distorted, reversed recording of Enmu's voice. "Sleep and laugh!" The ink demon lashed out, its arm extending like a hydraulic piston. It struck a group of lower-ranked slayers. It did not cut them, it splashed them. Where the ink touched, their bodies flattened. They became two-dimensional cutouts of themselves, paper dolls fluttering in the wind, screaming in voices that were mere scribbles of sound. The mask saw this, and his jaw dropped. "Hey, that's my bit. Copyright infringement." He pulled out a giant eraser, but the ink demon was faster. It dissolved into a puddle and surged outward, a tidal wave of corrupting black fluid. It washed over the district's wisteria incense burners, the barriers that kept demons out. The wisteria flowers withered instantly, turning into black, drooping weeds that whispered insults. The protective barrier of Asakusa was gone. The scent of the corrupt ink spread outward, carrying a signal that every demon in Tokyo could smell. It was a signal that the rules were broken. The midnight veil that kept the war between slayers and demons in the shadows was dissolving. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Not the whistles of the Taisho police, but the heavy, mechanical sirens of the military. The commotion had drawn the attention of the Imperial Army. Searchlights swept the district. They illuminated the scene. A green-faced man, a giant stone monk sinking in bubblegum, a spherical wind swordsman, and a tidal wave of living ink turning people into paper. The secret war was over. The public was watching. Tanjiro, standing on a roof that was slowly turning into a giant mushroom, realized the magnitude of the loss. The Demon Slayer Corps relied on secrecy to operate without government interference and to prevent mass panic. Now, the government would see them as monsters. The mask had not just defeated them, he had exposed them. And worse, he had created a new breed of demon. The ink demon, Enmu Tun, was spreading, coating the buildings in darkness that birthed miniature, cackling ink minions. The mask looked at the arriving military trucks. He grinned. "The cavalry, I love a parade." He spun into his tornado form, changing his outfit instantly. He emerged wearing a drum major's uniform with a baton. He marched toward the soldiers who were setting up a barricade. "Strike up the band," he yelled. The soldiers fired. The bullets flew toward him. The mask caught them in his teeth, chewed them, and spat them out as machine gun fire. But the bullets were now kernels of popcorn that exploded on impact, burying the front line of the army in buttery foam. Guillaume freed himself from the bubblegum earth with a burst of strength that tore the street apart. He grabbed Sanemi, who was bouncing uncontrollably, and shouted to Tanjiro, "Retreat! We must retreat. The situation is beyond our understanding." It was a crushing command. Hashira did not retreat. They died standing, but Guillaume knew that staying here meant becoming part of the joke. They had to regroup. They had to understand what this green energy was before it consumed them all. Tanjiro hesitated. He looked at the mask, who was now leading a conga line of confused, hypnotized soldiers. He looked at the ink demon, which was consuming the city block, turning reality into a dark cartoon. He saw a mother and child being turned into cardboard cutouts, their terror frozen in ink. He wanted to stay. He wanted to fight, but the air was getting harder to breathe. The funny gas was filling his lungs, making his limbs feel rubbery. He felt the urge to laugh at the horror. That terrified him more than death. If he laughed, he lost his soul. "Tanjiro, go!" Guillaume roared, throwing the bouncing Sanemi over his shoulder like a ball. Tanjiro grit his teeth, tears streaming down his face. He turned and fled, leaping away from the madness of Asakusa. Behind him, the district was no longer part of Taisho, Japan. It was a glowing, pulsating zone of anarchy, where the laws of physics were optional, and the new master was a green-faced god who treated the apocalypse as a stand-up routine. As the slayers vanished into the night, the mask stopped his parade. He watched them go. The ink demon surged toward him, looking for a master. The mask slapped the demon on the nose with a rolled-up newspaper. "Down, boy. We have a show to plan." He looked up at the moon. It wasn't the calm moon of the Demon Slayer nights. He reached up and adjusted it, tilting the crescent moon so it looked like a smiling mouth. "Now," he whispered to the empty ruined city, "let's go find the guy in the fancy suit who thinks he runs this joint. I hear he likes blood. I prefer ketchup." In the Infinity Castle, Muzan Kibutsuji sat in silence. The dimensional doors were locked, but he could feel it. He could feel the reality of Asakusa rotting. He could feel the birth of the ink demon, and he could feel the humiliating, terrifying pulse of a power that did not respect biology. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Demon King felt like prey, not to the sun, but to something far brighter and far more burning. He looked at his hand. It was trembling, and on his palm, a small green smiley face had appeared, tattooed into his immortal flesh. He scratched at it, clawing the skin away, but the skin regenerated, and the smiley face was still there, winking. The infection had reached the king. The timeline had not just branched, it had snapped. The butterfly mansion had transformed from a sanctuary of healing into a containment facility for a biological impossibility. The air in the intensive care ward did not smell of antiseptic or wisteria. It smelled of hot rubber and static electricity. Shinobu Kocho stood over the bed, where the wind Hashira, Sanemi Shinazugawa, was being restrained. The restraints were not standard ropes, but thick chains reinforced with iron, usually reserved for capturing demons alive for study. They were necessary not because Sanemi was violent, though his rage was palpable, but because his physiology had rejected the fundamental laws of human density. He was floating. Every time he shifted his weight, his body bobbed against the ceiling like a helium-filled balloon in the shape of a man. His skin had taken on a plastic sheen, reflecting the candlelight with an unnatural gloss. When the Kakushi tried to draw blood to test for toxins, the needles did not pierce his skin. They bent. When they applied more force, the skin depressed elastically and then launched the needle back across the room with the velocity of a blow dart. Sanemi was screaming, but the sound was not the guttural roar of the wind Hashira. It was a high-pitched, vibrating squeak that sounded like a dog toy being strangled. He was begging Shinobu to kill him, to cut him open and let the cursed air out, but Shinobu could not. She had tried to nick his vein with her poison-laced stiletto. The blade had bounced off, emitting a comical boing sound that echoed through the silent, horrified infirmary. This was not a wound. It was a rewriting of Sanemi's existence. The Toon Force, as the entity had demonstrated, was not a technique or a blood art. It was a contagious metaphysical radiation. Sanemi had been hit by the entity's breath, by its proximity, and now his cells were no longer processing oxygen to create energy. They were processing comedy to create elasticity. Shinobu looked at the microscope slide where she had placed a sample of Sanemi's saliva. Under the lens, the cells were not dividing. They were dancing. Little microscopic nuclei were wearing top hats and kicking their legs in a synchronized chorus line. Shinobu felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was a cancer of reality. If this spread, if the other Hashira were infected, the Demon Slayer core would not just be defeated. They would be turned into a punchline. She slammed her fist onto the table, cracking the wood. The logic of her pharmaceutical genius was useless here. Poison worked on biology. Wisteria worked on demons. Nothing worked on a living cartoon. At the Ubuyashiki estate, the atmosphere was funereal. Kagaya Ubuyashiki sat on the veranda. His blind eyes turned toward the burning glow on the horizon that used to be the entertainment district of Asakusa. The curse of the Ubuyashiki bloodline gave him foresight, a connection to the flow of fate, but now that flow was screaming. It was as if the river of time had been dammed up and replaced with a chaotic whirlpool. He could feel the presence of the stranger, the green one, pulsing like a migraine in the collective consciousness of Japan. Beside him, his wife Amani adjusted the blanket over his shoulders, her hands trembling. The Kasugai crows were silent, huddled in the trees, refusing to fly toward the neon light. Kiyome Himejima stood in the courtyard, his massive stone frame rigid. He had washed the bubble gum from his robes, but the smell of artificial sugar lingered, a sweet stench that made the stone Hashira nauseous. He reported the events with a heavy heart, describing the way his iron flail had been eaten, the way the earth had turned to liquid, and the terrifying emergence of the ink demon from the remains of Enmu. Kagaya spoke, his voice frail, but carrying the absolute weight of command. This was not a demon, he explained. Demons were part of the natural order, a shadow cast by the light of humanity. They were tragic, twisted beings bound by rules, the sun, wisteria, decapitation. This entity obeyed no rules. It was an invader from a reality where consequence did not exist. If Muzan was a disease, the mask was the cure that killed the patient. They faced a choice. They could continue to fight the demons, who were now just as terrified as the humans, or they could turn their attention to the existential threat that was unmaking the world. Kagaya ordered a total retreat from the eastern districts. He declared a forbidden zone around Asakusa. No slayer below the rank of Hashira was to approach. And then he did the unthinkable. He ordered the unsealing of the archives of the first breaths, the forbidden texts that detailed the origins of the breathing styles, looking for any mention of a chaotic force that predated the sun. He also sent a single, unmarked letter via a cat, not a crow, to the hidden clinic of Tamayo. If science and swordsmanship failed, perhaps the demon doctor could understand the pathology of this new god. In the Infinity Castle, the panic was not quiet. It was vertical. The dimensional fortress was experiencing seismic tremors. Nakime sat in her central platform, sweating, her demon blood boiling as she tried to keep the rooms aligned. The presence of the mask in the physical world was acting like a gravitational singularity, pulling the dimensional spaces of the blood demon art toward it. Corridors were stretching. Doors were opening into brick walls. Muzan Kibutsuji paced the floor of his private chamber, his form shifting rapidly between a child, a woman, and his combat form, his biology unable to settle on a shape that felt safe. The smiley face tattoo on his palm was throbbing. He had tried to cut the hand off. He had regenerated a new hand. The tattoo had been there on the new skin before the blood even dried. It was marking him. It was mocking him. Muzan summoned the upper moons. They arrived not with their usual swagger, but with caution. Kokushibo, upper rank 1, knelt with the stoic discipline of a samurai, but his 6 eyes were darting around the room, sensing the instability of the castle. Doma, upper rank 2, was smiling, but the smile was brittle. He fanned himself with his golden fans, commenting on the festive atmosphere of the distant city. Akaza, upper rank 3, was visibly disturbed. He could not sense the battle spirit of the enemy, and that void terrified him more than any overwhelming power. Muzan did not waste time with pleasantries. He projected his memories of the encounter into their minds. He showed them the green man. He showed them the humiliation. And he showed them the ink demon, the abomination that had once been Enmu. That thing, Muzan hissed, his voice sounding like grinding stones, was an insult to his blood. Enmu had been weak, but he was Muzan's property. For this green sorcerer to take Muzan's blood and twist it into a flat, ink-based parody was a declaration of war on the concept of demonhood itself. Muzan commanded them. They were not to engage the mask directly if they could avoid it. They were to study it. They were to find the source of its power, the object, the face covering, and destroy it. But first, they had to purge the ink demon. It was a rival apex predator, consuming humans and demons alike, turning them into paper slaves. If the ink demon consumed enough biomass, it might challenge Muzan for control of the night. Muzan ordered Doma and Akaza to Asakusa. Kokushibo was to remain as the final guard. The Demon King, for the first time, was entrenching himself. He was afraid of being erased. Asakusa had become a kingdom of madness. The Toon Zone had expanded, covering 3 square miles of Tokyo. Inside the zone, it was always night, but a night illuminated by neon signs that floated in the air without wires. The laws of physics were replaced by the rule of funny. Gravity worked only when you looked down. Momentum was dictated by the musical score that seemed to emanate from the pavement itself. In the center of the district, the mask had constructed a headquarters, a massive, erratic skyscraper shaped like a giant conga drum, topped with a spinning disco ball the size of a house. He called it the Coco Bongo Castle. Inside, the mask sat on a throne made of whoopee cushions, surrounded by a court of animated objects. Tables danced with chairs. Lampposts served drinks. It was a party that never ended, a manic celebration of energy without purpose. But in the shadows of the Toon Zone, the Ink Demon was building its own empire. The Ink Demon did not want to party. It wanted to drown the world. It had taken over the sewers and the subways, filling them with the black, sentient fluid. The civilians who had been trapped in the zone were not dead, but they were no longer human. They had been flattened. They shuffled through the streets as 2-dimensional cutouts, their voices reduced to speech bubbles that appeared over their heads. They were safe from physical harm. You couldn't stab a drawing. But they had lost their free will, becoming background characters in the mask's show or slaves to the Ink Demon's expansion. The Ink Demon, a towering, dripping monstrosity with Enmu's sadistic consciousness amplified by cartoon logic, despised the mask. The mask was the chaotic creator. The Ink Demon was the chaotic destroyer. They were 2 sides of the same reality-warping coin, destined to clash. Akaza and Doma entered the zone. The transition was jarring. As they crossed the invisible barrier, the texture of the world changed. The gritty, realistic details of the Taisho era smoothed out. Colors became flat and vibrant. Shadows became solid black shapes. Akaza looked at his hands. The blue tattoos on his skin had become animated, swirling around his arms like snakes. He clenched his fist, and a squeaky sound effect accompanied the motion. He growled, his warrior pride revolting against the aesthetic. Doma, however, was delighted. He touched a wall, and it giggled. He plucked a flower, and it squirted water in his face. He laughed, licking the water. It tasted like lime soda. This world, Doma mused, was devoid of suffering because It was devoid of meaning. It was perfect for him. They found the ink demon in the subway station. The station walls were coated in the black sludge, pulsing with a heartbeat. The ink demon hung from the ceiling, a spider made of fluid, its eyes spinning spirals. It sensed the upper moons. It did not fear them. It remembered being Enmu, remembered the fear of the upper ranks. But that memory was distant, like a bad dream. Now it had the power of the tune. It dropped to the floor, splashing into a puddle and reforming instantly behind Akaza. Upper 3, the ink demon's voice scratched, appearing as jagged text in the air. You look three-dimensional, gross. Akaza did not talk. He struck. Destructive death, compass needle. The snowflake compass deployed under his feet. He sensed the malice of the ink demon. It was not a fighting spirit. It was a drowning spirit. Akaza punched, a shockwave of air capable of crushing a train car. The punch hit the ink demon's chest. The ink splashed. A hole appeared in the demon's torso, perfectly round. Through the hole, Akaza could see the tiled wall behind. The ink demon looked down at the hole. It grabbed a paintbrush from the air and painted the hole black. The torso was whole again. Is that it? The ink demon taunted. It lashed out with a whip made of ink. The whip cracked, turning into a giant spiked roller. Akaza dodged, the roller crushing the platform where he had stood. The roller didn't break the concrete. It flattened it into a grey pancake. Doma intervened. Blood demon art. Lotus ice. He waved his fan, sending a blizzard of razor-sharp ice shards toward the creature. The ice hit the ink. The ink froze. The ink demon halted, its fluid form turning into a jagged black ice sculpture. Doma clapped his hands. Beautiful. Modern art. But the victory was short-lived. The ice began to crack, not from force, but from vibration. The ink demon was vibrating its molecules. The ice shattered, exploding outward. The shards of ice turned into glass birds in midair, which flew back at Doma, pecking at his eyes. The ink demon had transmuted the attack. It was learning. It was adapting the blood demon arts into gags. Suddenly, the ceiling of the subway station dissolved. Not collapsed, dissolved. A giant circular saw cut a hole in the street above, and the circle of pavement fell, crushing the ink demon flat. The mask dropped through the hole, wearing a construction worker's outfit and holding a jackhammer. "Road work ahead," he yelled, the sound echoing with stadium reverb. He looked at Akaza and Doma. "Hey, no fighting in the library. Shh." He held a giant finger to his lips. Akaza looked at the mask. This was the target, the source of the madness. Akaza ignored the flattened ink demon and launched himself at the mask. Destructive death, annihilation type. It was his ultimate technique, an explosive charge of energy meant to atomize the opponent. The mask watched the glowing blue energy approaching. He didn't move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a mirror. He held it up. The blast hit the mirror. Physics broke. The beam bounced off the glass at a perfect angle, flying back and hitting Akaza in the chest. The upper moon was blasted backward, slamming into Doma, and both demons were buried under a pile of rubble that the mask had conveniently tipped over from a dump truck that hadn't been there a second ago. The mask dusted off his hands, but the puddle of ink beneath the fallen pavement circle began to ooze. The ink demon reformed, larger this time, absorbing the ambient shadows of the tunnel. It towered over the mask, a 20-foot giant of dripping darkness. "I am the nightmare," the ink demon roared. The mask looked up, unimpressed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the giant sponge. A regular yellow kitchen sponge, but the size of a mattress. He threw it at the ink demon. The sponge hit the ink. It began to absorb. The ink demon screamed as its mass was sucked into the yellow pores. The mask squeezed the sponge, wringing out the demon into a bucket. He capped the bucket with a lid that read, "Toxic waste." "Clean up on aisle 5, the mask quipped. But then the bucket began to shake. The lid flew off. The ink exploded outward, not as liquid, but as gas. Black mist filled the subway. Akaza and Doma, recovering from the rubble, inhaled the mist. The corruption entered their systems. Akaza felt his muscles twitch. He looked at his arm. It was inflating. He tried to use his regeneration to purge it, but his cells were betraying him. His arm turned into a giant boxing glove. Doma felt his eyes turning into vanilla soft serve. The ink demon was not just a physical threat. It was a viral agent that could rewrite the biological code of demons. High above the chaos, in the hidden clinic, Tamayo stared at the blood sample Yushiro had retrieved from the edge of the zone. It was green. It glowed. And under the microscope, it was eating the demon cells she had introduced to it. But it wasn't destroying them. It was dressing them up. The demon cells were growing tiny bow ties. Tamayo, a woman who had spent centuries studying the biology of monsters, felt a wave of nausea. This was the ED in its purest form. The mask was an object that unleashed the repressed desires of the wearer, granting them the power to shape reality to fit those desires. But because the wearer was a chaotic variable, the reality was chaos. There was no scientific cure for this. You couldn't vaccinate against a joke, but she noticed something else. The green cells burned out quickly. They required a constant supply of adrenaline and attention. The mask fed on the spectacle. If the spectacle stopped, the power faded. "Yushiro," Tamayo said, her voice trembling. "We cannot kill it with poison. We cannot kill it with strength. We have to kill it with boredom. Or," she hesitated, "we have to introduce a narrative that overrides its own. We have to give it a tragic ending." Back in the zone, the battle had moved to the surface. The mask was fighting the upper moons and the reforming ink demons simultaneously. He was winning, but the strain was visible. He was panting, his tongue lolling out like a tired dog. Every time he used the toon force, reality snapped back harder. The sky was cracking. Purple fissures were opening in the air, revealing the void between dimensions. The universe was rejecting the parasite. The mask didn't care. He was having the time of his life. He grabbed a street lamp and used it as a baseball bat to hit the fireballs Akaza was throwing. Home run! The fireballs flew into the distance, exploding into fireworks that spelled "Muzan sucks." But the ink demon was relentless. It was not bound by the need for an audience. It just wanted to consume. It wrapped its tendrils around the Coco Bongo castle, squeezing. The structure groaned. The mask turned to defend his fortress, but Doma, seizing the opening, unleashed his blood demon art rhyme, Water Lily Bodhisattva. A giant ice statue rose, grabbing the mask in its frozen hands. The cold was absolute. It was the cold of death, of entropy, of the heat death of the universe. The mask shivered. His green face turned blue. He tried to vibrate, but the ice held him. The toon force struggled against the absolute zero of Doma's nihilism. Akaza saw the opening. He charged, his fist glowing with the power of the end. He wasn't aiming for the body. He was aiming for the face. He was aiming for the wood. He threw the punch. The mask's eyes widened. He couldn't dodge. The ice held him. The fist connected. Crack. The sound was not funny. It was the dry, brittle sound of ancient wood fracturing. A hairline fracture appeared on the green mask. The world froze. The neon lights flickered. The music stopped. The mask looked at Akaza, and for the first time, there was no humor in his eyes. There was only the ancient, terrifying wrath of the Norse god locked inside the object. The green light flared, blindingly bright, turning the night into day. The ice shattered. Akaza was thrown back by a shockwave of pure psychic pressure. The mask grabbed his face. He howled. The howl was not a laugh. It was the sound of a tornado siren. The crack in the mask was leaking energy. Raw, unfiltered, chaotic potential. The reality of Asakusa began to delaminate. Buildings floated away. The ground dissolved into a checkerboard void. The mask had been damaged, and in his pain, he was no longer playing a game. He was breaking the cartridge. Muzan, watching through Akaza's eyes, felt a spike of genuine terror. He had ordered the destruction of the mask, but he had not anticipated that the object contained a power that could delete existence. If the mask broke completely, it wouldn't just kill the wearer. It would create a black hole of unreality that would swallow Japan. "Retreat," Muzan screamed into Akaza's mind. "Get away from it. It's a bomb." But it was too late to run. The mask, glowing with unstable energy, looked at the demons. He reached into the tear in the sky, the purple void, and pulled. He pulled the fabric of the universe down. He wasn't bringing the moon down. He was bringing the credits down. A giant black curtain began to descend from the heavens, rolling over the city, erasing everything it touched. The end? No. The mask grabbed the edge of the curtain and wrapped it around himself like a cloak, turning into a giant, shadowy avatar of Loki. "You broke my toy," the voice boomed, no longer nasal, but deep and resonant. "Now I'm going to break your story." The avatar of chaos raised a hand. The ink demon tried to flee, but the avatar pointed a finger. "Delete." The ink demon didn't flatten. It didn't turn into a gag. It simply ceased to exist. The ink evaporated, leaving nothing behind. Not even a memory. Enmu was gone, erased from the timeline. Akaza and Doma stared at the space where the ink demon had been. They understood instantly. This was not a fight. This was an edit. And they were next. The mask turned his gaze to the demon slayers who were watching from the perimeter. He saw Tanjiro. He saw the sword. And he smiled a cracked, terrifying smile. "Time for a genre shift," he whispered. "Let's make this a horror movie." The world stuttered, colors inverted, and when the image stabilized, the mask was gone. The upper moons were gone, and Asakusa was gone. In its place was a blank white void, a missing chunk of the map where the code of the universe had been corrupted. And in the center of the void, lying on the nothingness, was the wooden mask, the crack running down its center, waiting for the next face to claim it. But the green man was nowhere to be seen. He had not left. He had gone into the narrative itself. He had become the narrator. And the first thing the new narrator did was change the rules of demon slaying. The sun rose, but it was green, and it didn't burn the demons. It made them stronger. It gave them toon force. The escalation was complete. The systems had not just clashed. They had merged into a nightmare hybrid. The golden age of heroes was over. The age of the green sun had begun. The rising of the sun had always been the absolute, unwavering promise of the Demon Slayer core. For 1,000 years, the dawn was the hammer of God, the only force capable of turning the immortal flesh of demons into ash. The Slayers fought through the night not to win, but to survive until the solar sphere breached the horizon and delivered salvation. But as the light crested the mountains of the Kanto region following the catastrophe in Asakusa, the promise was broken. The sun did not rise as a burning orb of gold and vermilion. It rose as a sickly, pulsating sphere of neon lime, The light it cast was not warm. It was radioactive and gelatinous, coating the world in a hue that tasted of copper and cheap sugar. The green sun did not burn the demons. It liberated them. Across Japan, demons who had been scurrying for the shadows stopped. They felt the light touch their skin, and instead of the searing agony of cellular destruction, they felt a surge of manic, effervescent power. The solar radiation had been transmuted by the mask's lingering narrative control into a source of toon force energy. In a forest clearing, a low-level demon who had been seconds away from burrowing underground looked at his hands. They were glowing. He laughed, and his jaw unhinged, dropping to the forest floor with a metallic clang. He picked it up, screwed it back on, and realized he was no longer bound by the biological limitations of Muzan's blood. He was bound only by the logic of a gag. He saw a slayer approaching, a young boy trembling with a Nichirin blade. The demon did not attack with claws. He reached behind his back and pulled out a comically large stick of dynamite. The slayer swung his sword. The blade struck the demon's neck but bounced off with a rubbery twang. The demon lit the fuse. The explosion did not kill the demon. It blackened his face and blew his hair back. But he simply shook off the soot and grinned. The slayer, however, was not a cartoon. The shockwave ruptured his internal organs, and he collapsed, coughing blood that looked terrifyingly red against the green-lit world. The panic that swept through the demon slayer core was total. The Kasugai crows fell from the sky, their navigational instincts scrambled by the chaotic magnetic field of the green sun. At the Butterfly Mansion, the situation had devolved into a nightmare of triage. The injured slayers brought in from the night's patrol were not suffering from lacerations or poison. They were suffering from existential dysmorphia. A boy whose legs had been tied into a knot by a demon was screaming because he could not untie them, and his bones had turned to rope. Shinobu Kocho, exhausted and terrified, looked out the window at the green sky. She understood the chemical implication immediately. The ultraviolet spectrum had been replaced. The wisteria flowers in the garden were rapidly wilting, shedding their petals which turned into moths and flew away. The barrier was down. The sanctuary was open. In the Infinity Castle, the reaction was equally chaotic but inverted. Muzan Kibutsuji felt the green sun's rays penetrate the dimensional layers of his fortress. For the first time in his life, he stood in the light. It did not kill him. It made him feel invincible, but also ridiculous. His cells were vibrating with a chaotic potential that disgusted his perfectionist nature. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were no longer red plum vertical slits. They were spinning spirals. He smashed the mirror, but the reflection remained, mocking him. He realized that while the green sun gave his kind power, it stripped them of their dignity and their hierarchy. The lower moons, the rabble he had dismissed, were now empowered by the same force that fueled the upper ranks. If a random ghoul could pull a mallet out of thin air, what use was the 12 Kazuki? Muzan realized he was facing a rebellion of physics. To restore order, he needed the source. He needed the mask. The white void where Asakusa once stood was the only place unaffected by the green sun. It was a hole in the script, a blank page waiting to be written. In the center of that nothingness, the wooden mask lay dormant, the crack in its surface leaking a faint black smoke. The entity that had worn it, the narrator, was gone, diffused into the atmosphere, but the object remained the anchor. Kagaya Ubuyashiki, sensing the shift in the fabric of destiny, made the call that would end the era of secrecy. He contacted the remaining Hashira via the only communication method that still worked, written letters delivered by cats, whose chaotic nature allowed them to navigate the Toon Zone. The order was simple: enter the void, retrieve the mask, destroy it before the green sun becomes permanent. Tanjiro Kamado, Giyu Tomioka, and the reluctant Zenitsu Agatsuma stood at the edge of the void. The transition from the green-lit city to the absolute white of the emptiness was jarring. Sound did not travel normally here. It appeared as text floating in the air. When Tanjiro stepped forward, the word step materialized under his boot. He tightened his grip on his sword. He could smell the mask. It didn't smell like a demon or a human. It smelled like possibilities. It smelled like the fear of being forgotten. Beside him, Akaza appeared. The upper rank 3 did not attack. He looked at the Slayers with a grim expression. The Toon Force had humiliated him, stripped him of his martial honor. He wanted the mask destroyed as much as they did. A silent, uneasy truce formed on the precipice of the blank page. The enemy of my enemy is a reality warper. They walked into the white. Time had no meaning here. They walked for what felt like seconds and centuries. Finally, they reached the center. The mask lay on a pedestal of nothingness. It was small, unassuming, an ancient piece of wood that held the power to rewrite gods. But they were not the first to arrive. Muzan Kibutsuji was there. He had not walked. He had edited himself into the scene. He stood over the mask, his hand hovering over it. But he was hesitating. The smiley face on his palm was burning. He knew that if he touched it, he might not control it. It might control him. He might become just another character in its show. "Get away from it," Tanjiro shouted, the speech bubble appearing over his head in jagged red font. Muzan turned. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes were spinning. "You think you can stop this boy?" Muzan said, his voice echoing without a source. "This world is broken. The sun is a joke. The night is a gag. I will take this power and I will force it to make sense. I will impose a script of absolute order upon this chaos." "No," Akaza stepped forward. "You don't understand it, Master. It doesn't respect order. It hates order. If you put that on, you won't be the Demon King. You'll be the Jester." Muzan snarled and lashed out with a whip of flesh. Akaza dodged, the movement creating a whoosh text effect. The truce was broken. The battle for the narrative began. Giyu and Tanjiro charged Muzan, their breathing techniques manifesting visually. Water breathing created literal waves of blue water that splashed onto the white floor. Sun breathing created streaks of fire that burned the paper-white reality. But Muzan was boosted by the green sun. He didn't just dodge, he edited his position. He would vanish and reappear behind them. He grabbed Giyu by the throat and lifted him. Giyu struggled, but Muzan's grip was absolute. "I will erase you," Muzan whispered. He prepared to crush the water Hashira's neck. Then the small choice occurred, the choice that would doom the timeline. Tanjiro saw Giyu dying. He saw Akaza being held back by a barrier of invisible walls Muzan had erected. He saw the mask lying on the ground, unguarded. Tanjiro knew he could not defeat Muzan with his sword. The gap in power was too great, and the physics of the world were too broken. He looked at the mask. He remembered the smell of the entity, the loneliness, the desire to be seen, the chaotic joy. He realized the mask was not a weapon. It was a person. It was a trapped soul. Tanjiro made his choice. He did not try to cut Muzan. He did not try to cut the mask. He sheathed his sword. He dove for the mask. Muzan saw the boy move. He dropped Giyu and swiped at Tanjiro, tearing the back of his haori. But Tanjiro tumbled forward, his hand closing around the wooden object. He rolled to his feet, holding the mask in both hands. "Don't do it, Tanjiro," Zenitsu screamed, his eyes popping out. Tanjiro did not put the mask on his face. He held it to his chest. He closed his eyes. He used the total concentration breathing, but he directed it not into his limbs, but into the mask. He tried to synchronize his breathing with the chaotic rhythm of the object. He tried to heal it. He tried to use the empathetic connection of the sun breathing, the original breath that connected all life, to soothe the rage of the Norse artifact. He whispered, "You don't have to be alone. You don't have to be loud to be heard." It was an act of supreme compassion. It was the logic of a shonen hero, the belief that understanding can resolve conflict. And it was the wrong genre. The mask did not want to be healed. The mask was not a misunderstood demon. The mask was an artifact of Loki, the god of mischief. It was concentrated, weaponized chaos. When Tanjiro poured the order and purity of sun breathing into the cracked vessel of absolute chaos, he didn't purify it. He completed the circuit. He provided the one thing the mask lacked, a power source of infinite, disciplined energy. The crack in the mask sealed shut. The wood changed color. It turned from green to a burning, terrifying red. The Hanafuda earrings on Tanjiro's ears began to vibrate. The mask didn't wait to be worn. It liquefied. It turned into red slime and flowed over Tanjiro's hands, up his arms, and consumed his body. Tanjiro screamed, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of realization. He had made a mistake. He had opened the door to something that made Muzan look like a common disease. The red slime covered his face. It hardened. Muzan stepped back. Genuine horror etched on his face. "What have you done?" The figure that stood before them was no longer Tanjiro Kamado. It was a fusion of the Demon Slayer mark and the mask. He wore a suit, but it was a checkered pattern of black and green Hari fabric, tailored into a sharp zoot suit cut. His face was a crimson mask, with the black flame mark of the sun breath searing across the forehead. His eyes were not dots, they were burning suns. He did not smile with teeth, he smiled with fire. The entity adjusted his tie. He looked at Muzan. He looked at Giyu. He looked at the fourth wall, looking directly at the viewer of this history. "Smokin," the entity said. But the voice was not the zany voice of the previous wearer. It was Tanjiro's voice, amplified by the power of a god, layered with the roar of a solar flare. Actually, the entity corrected himself, snapping his fingers, creating a spark that blinded everyone. "Let's call it Hinokami Kagura, Dance of the Chaos God." Muzan attacked. He had to. He launched a barrage of spinal whips, moving at speeds that exceeded sound. The red mask didn't dodge. He drew his sword, but it wasn't a Nichirin blade anymore. It was a beam of solid light, a lightsaber made of solar plasma. He swung it once. The slice cut through the whips. It cut through Muzan's torso. It cut through the white void. It cut through the background of the scene. A black tear opened in reality, revealing the static of a television screen behind the world. Muzan shrieked as his halves tried to regenerate, but the wound was cauterized by plot armor. The red mask stepped forward, grabbing the Demon King by the hair. "You know, Muzan," the red mask said, his tone conversational but terrifyingly intense. "You always wanted to be the perfect being. You wanted to conquer the sun. Well, congratulations." The red mask leaned in, his face inches from the terrified Demon King. "I am the sun." The red mask opened his mouth and breathed. It wasn't fire. It was pure narrative erasure. A blast of red energy engulfed Muzan. The Demon King, the progenitor of all demons, the being who had terrorized Japan for a millennium, did not die. He was retconned. His body dissolved into ink, then into sketches, then into nothing. Muzan Kibutsuji was erased from the timeline. But the victory was a catastrophe. The energy release shattered the boundaries of the Demon Slayer universe. The small choice of trying to heal the mask had created a being that could destroy the setting. The red mask looked at Giyu and Akaza. He tilted his head. "The bad guy is gone," the red mask said. "But the show must go on, and I'm bored." He raised his hand. The white void shattered like glass. The green sun in the sky turned red. The world of Taisho Japan began to merge with something else. Skyscrapers from the 1990s began to grow out of the rice paddies. Zeppelins from Gotham City appeared in the sky over Mount Fuji. The multiverse was leaking. Akaza looked at his hands. They were turning into comic book ink. He looked at the red mask. "What are you?" The red mask spun his sword, sheathing it in a scabbard that was now a folded comic book. "I'm the crossover event," he said. "And we're going to have so much fun." The ground beneath them fell away. Gravity inverted. Giyu Tomioka fell up into a sky filled with police sirens and gargoyles. The red mask grabbed Akaza and Zenitsu, pulling them into a portal that swirled with the colors of a printing press. The Demon Slayer universe had ceased to exist as a self-contained reality. It had become a chaotic frontier town in the larger map of the mask's omniverse. Tanjiro was gone. There was only the sun god mask, and he was taking his friends to the big city. The massive multiversal outcome was absolute. The genre had shifted from historical fantasy to cosmic horror comedy, and there was no turning back. The sky over the merged reality of Neo-Edo was not a celestial dome, but a flickering canopy of cathode ray static, tuned to a dead channel that whispered white noise into the souls of the survivors. The collision of the Taisho era and the chaotic urban sprawl of the mask's dimension had settled into a grotesque stability. Mount Fuji still stood on the horizon, but it was now capped not with snow, but with a bubbling, molten frosting of neon-pink magma that illuminated the steel canyons of the city below. Skyscrapers made of paper and iron pierced the smog, their windows glowing like the compound eyes of insects. This was the Pax Tanjiro, a peace enforced by a deity who wore a checkered suit and a face of crimson wood. The war between demons and humans had ended, replaced by a regime of mandatory joy. In the streets, civilians walked with rictus grins, terrified to frown lest the red mask interpret their sadness as a cry for help and intervene with a reality-warping rescue that usually involved turning them into singing garden gnomes. High atop the tallest spire, a structure that resembled the Infinity Castle turned inside out and fused with a Gothic clock tower. The red mask sat upon a throne of melted Nichirin blades. The entity that had been Tanjiro Kamado was trapped within a prison of his own altruism. The mask had taken his core desire to protect his sister, to save his friends, to end the suffering, and amplified it through the lens of cartoon omnipotence. There was no suffering in Neo-Edo because suffering was edited out. Death was retconned into slapstick injury. Hunger was solved by raining giant hams from the clouds. But the cost was free will. The population was trapped in an infinite loop of the golden ending, a narrative stasis where nothing bad could happen, and therefore nothing mattered. Inside the resistance bunker, buried deep beneath the ruins of the Yoshiwara district, the remaining Hashira gathered. The bunker was shielded by Yushiro's talismans, which had been modified to scramble the narrative causality that the red mask used to locate trouble. Giyu Tomioka sat at a metal table, cleaning his gun. He no longer carried a sword. In this world, swords were punchlines. He carried a heavy, oversized revolver, loaded with bullets cast from the remains of the scarlet iron sand, the only material dense enough to ignore the tomb physics. Beside him, Sanemi Shinazugawa paced, his body still showing signs of the rubberization he had suffered, his movements occasionally accompanied by involuntary slide whistle sounds. He hated this world. He hated the safety of it. He preferred the honest brutality of demons to this suffocating synthetic paradise. Tamayo stood by a whiteboard covered in equations that tried to reconcile biology with ink. She looked older, her demon vitality drained by the constant effort of resisting the atmospheric pressure of the mask's reality. She spoke to the group, her voice raspy. The red mask, she explained, was burning out. The fusion of the sun breathing and the mask of Loki was unsustainable. Tanjiro's human soul was acting as a battery for a cosmic engine. The mask was consuming his memories, his personality, and his humanity to fuel the reality distortion. If they did not stop him soon, Tanjiro Kamado would cease to exist. He would become a permanent fixture of the mask, a mindless avatar of solar chaos. And when the battery ran dry, the reality would not just reset. It would collapse into a singularity of absolute nonsense, erasing the timeline completely. Akaza sat in the corner, his arms crossed. The former Upper Moon 3 was a shadow of his former self. His tattoos were fading. Without Muzan, without the hierarchy of the moons, and in a world where violence had no consequence, he had lost his purpose. He could not cultivate battle spirit because there was no battle, only performance. Yet he remained with the humans. He remained because the red mask offended him. It was the mockery of strength, to possess power without struggle, to enforce peace without conquest, was an insult to the martial code Akaza had spent centuries perfecting. He looked at Giyu. They were no longer enemies. They were the last two sane men in an insane asylum. Akaza nodded. He was ready to die, but he wanted to die fighting something real, not a cartoon. The plan was desperate. They could not kill the red mask. He was the protagonist of this twisted story, and the protagonist had plot armor. They had to change the genre. They had to force the narrative to shift from a comedic power fantasy to a tragedy. The mask drew power from the rule of cool and the rule of funny. To weaken it, they had to introduce the one thing the mask could not process: irreversible loss. They had to make the red mask fail. They had to put Nezuko in danger, real, unretconnable danger, and force Tanjiro to choose between the mask's power and his sister's reality. Nezuko Kamado sat in the center of the room. She had changed. The red sun had affected her demon blood, evolving her into a daywalker of a different kind. She did not burn in the light, but she did not sparkle with toon energy either. She had become a singularity of silence. In a world of loud noise and manic action, her silence was a weapon. She looked at Giyu and nodded. She understood. She was the bait. She was the anchor. And she was the only one who could reach the boy inside the monster. The assault on the Sun Tower began at midnight, though in Neo-Edo, the time was always showtime. The resistance emerged from the sewers, moving through the neon-lit streets. The city reacted immediately. The street lights bent down to inspect them. Fire hydrants turned into barking dogs. The red mask knew they were coming. He welcomed it. A hero needs villains to fight after all. From the tower, he broadcast his voice across the city, amplified by speakers that floated in the sky. Welcome guests. Tonight's episode is a special reunion. Don't touch the dial. The first line of defense was the paper Hashira. The red mask had taken his memories of the fallen comrades, Rengoku, Shinobu, Michiro. and animated them as origami constructs. They looked like the heroes Tanjiro remembered, but they moved with jerky, stop-motion stiffness. Rengoku made of burning paper descended on Sanemi, shouting hollow catchphrases about delicious food. Sanemi roared, tears streaming down his face as he slashed at the mockery of his friend. This was the psychological torture the mask inflicted. It gave you what you wanted, but stripped of its soul. Sanemi's wind-breathing, now adapted to the new physics, created vacuums that sucked the air out of the paper constructs, causing them to crumple. "Don't you dare speak with his voice," Sanemi screamed, tearing the paper Rengoku apart. The confetti that fell from the destroyed construct burned like embers. Giyu and Akaza pushed forward, aiming for the lobby of the tower. They were met by the ink blot corps, the remnants of the demon populace that had been conscripted into the Red Mask's army. These were demons who had surrendered their hunger for the safety of the cartoon. They wielded giant mallets and custard pies. Akaza moved through them like a phantom. He did not use his compass needle to find their spirits. He used his disdain. He punched a demon whose head was a giant bomb. The bomb exploded, but Akaza had already moved, using the shockwave to propel himself upward. Giyu fired his revolver. The bullets did not kill, they anchored. When a bullet hit a toon demon, it pinned their shadow to the ground, freezing them in place. "Gravity," Giyu muttered. "Remember gravity." They breached the tower. The interior was Aisha-like maze of staircases that went nowhere and doors that opened into space. Gyome Himejima, the stone Hashira, stayed behind at the entrance to hold the line. He slammed his flail into the ground, creating a zone of seismic stability. He began to chant, his deep voice drowning out the manic calliope music of the tower. He was the anchor of the real. As long as he chanted, the laws of physics inside the lobby held firm. He would not move. He would become a statue if he had to, a monument to the gravity that the mask despised. Giyu, Akaza, and Nezuko ascended. The higher they went, the more the reality frayed. The walls became panels of a comic book. They had to jump from panel to panel, crossing the white gutters of emptiness between moments of time. The red mask was playing with the medium itself. He was trying to trap them in a flashback, forcing them to relive their worst memories. Giyu saw his sister dying. Akaza saw his master and his lover, but they pushed through. They knew it was fake. They knew the narrator was unreliable. They reached the penthouse. The room was a vast, open space with no ceiling, looking up directly into the swirling vortex of the red sun. The red mask stood there, his back to them, conducting an orchestra of lightning bolts. He turned. The face was terrifying. The wooden mask had fused with Tanjiro's skin, the veins of the boy pulsing into the wood. The eyes were manic, spinning spirals of fire. "You're late," the red mask shouted. "The commercial break is almost over." "Tanjiro," Giyu said, his voice calm. "Take it off. Take it off." The red mask laughed, grabbing his own face and pulling. The skin stretched, but the mask stayed. "Why would I? I fixed it, Giyu. I fixed everything. No one dies. No one cries. Look." He gestured to a monitor wall. It showed the people of the city frozen in smiles. "Everyone is happy." "They are not happy," Nezuko said. Her voice was small, but it cut through the noise. "They are paused." The red mask twitched. The sound of a record scratch echoed through the universe. He looked at his sister. "Nezuko, I did this for you. You're safe. You'll never have to hide in a box again. I built you a world where the sun is your friend. I don't want a safe world." Nezuko stepped forward. Her form began to shift. The demon markings on her skin glowed. not with the green light of the mask, but with the dark crimson blood of her own power. I want a real one. The red mask snarled. Real is painful. Real is sad. I won't let you. He raised his hand. Scene change. The room dissolved. Suddenly, they were on a beach. It was a perfect, sunny beach, but the water was made of blue gelatin, and the sun was screaming. Beach episode, the red mask announced. Everyone relax. Akaza didn't relax. He attacked. Destructive death. End style. He poured every ounce of his remaining existence into a single strike. He wasn't aiming to kill Tanjiro. He was aiming to break the scene. The punch hit the gelatin ocean. The impact shattered the illusion. The beach cracked like glass, revealing the steel floor of the tower beneath. Your world is brittle, Akaza roared. It has no weight. The red mask screamed in frustration. He pulled a giant eraser from the air. You're ruining the vibe. He tried to erase Akaza. The eraser rubbed against the demon's arm, removing the skin. But Akaza didn't flinch. He grabbed the eraser and crushed it. The struggle was physical and metaphysical. Giyu signaled Nezuko. This was the moment. While the red mask was focused on Akaza, Nezuko charged. She didn't attack with claws. She attacked with her blood demon art, exploding blood. But she didn't aim it at the mask. She aimed it at herself. She set herself on fire. The pink flames engulfed her. It was a calculated risk. Her flames burned away demon toxins, but they also burned away magic. She was betting that the mask's power was, at its core, a form of foreign magic that could be purged. She tackled her brother. The burning girl slammed into the sun god. The flames licked at the wooden mask. The red mask shrieked, not in pain, but in confusion. The fire wasn't following the script. Fire was supposed to be funny. It was supposed to leave you covered in soot. This fire burned. It hurt. The pain broke the trance of the Toon Force. Inside the mental landscape, Tanjiro woke up. He felt the heat. He smelled the burning flesh of his sister. Nezuko, Tanjiro's voice echoed from inside the mask. Let go, Tanjiro, Nezuko cried, holding him tight, the flames spreading to his suit. Let go of the perfect world. The red mask struggled, the two personalities warring for control. The entity wanted to turn Nezuko into a marshmallow to save her. Tanjiro wanted to rip the mask off to save her. The dissonance created a feedback loop. The red sun above them began to pulse violently. The reality started to glitch. Objects flickered between 2D and 3D. The colors inverted. Tamayo's voice came over the radio in Giyu's ear. The narrative is collapsing. The mask is trying to reboot. You have to break the loop, cause permanent damage. Giyu looked at his gun. He had one bullet left, the scarlet iron sand. He looked at the struggling siblings. He couldn't shoot Tanjiro. He couldn't shoot Nezuko. He had to shoot the connection. He had to shoot the idea of invincibility. Giyu aimed not at the mask, but at the Hanafuda earrings, the symbols of the sun breather, the legacy, the burden. I'm sorry, Tanjiro, Giyu whispered, but the story has to end. He fired. The bullet flew through the chaotic air, ignoring the warping gravity. It struck the left earring. The impact shattered the jewelry. The ancient family heirloom, passed down for generations, disintegrated. The loss was small, but the symbolism was infinite. The perfect continuity was broken. The red mask gasped. A piece of the costume had been destroyed. The golden ending was flawed. The crack in the mask reopened. Tanjiro seized the moment. Inside the mindscape, he saw the green spirit of the mask offering him a remote control to rewind the scene. We can fix it, the spirit urged. We can do another take. Tanjiro looked at the remote. He looked at his sister burning in the real world. He looked at the chaos he had wrought. "No more takes," Tanjiro said. He headbutted the spirit. In the physical world, Tanjiro's hands moved. They didn't move with the robbery ease of the cartoon. They moved with the straining, human effort of a boy pushing past his limits. He gripped the edges of the wooden mask. His fingers dug into his own skin. He screamed, a sound of pure human agony. "Hinokami Kagura," Tanjiro gasped, the breath burning his lungs. Clear blue sky. He didn't use the form to slash. He used the concept. He visualized a clear blue sky, a sky without a green sun, without a red sun, without neon clouds, a sky of emptiness, a sky of peace. He ripped the mask off. The sound was deafening. It sounded like a universe tearing in half. A blast of green and red energy exploded outward, blowing the roof off the tower. The red sun imploded, sucking the toon energy back into the void. The skyscrapers of Neo-Edo groaned as the magic supporting their impossible architecture vanished. Tanjiro fell backward, the wooden mask clattering to the floor. His face was covered in blood, the skin raw where the wood had fused. But he was him. He was human. He looked at Nezuko. She was burned, panting, but the flames had died down. She was healing, not instantly, but slowly, painfully, beautifully. But the mask was not done. The object lay on the floor, smoking. The spirit was exposed. A swirling vortex of green smoke rose from the wood, forming the giant, disembodied head of the mask entity. It looked down at the mortals who had rejected its gift. "You boring little ants," the big head roared. "I gave you paradise. I gave you ratings, and you cancelled me." The big head opened its mouth to swallow them whole. It was the final escalation. The comic authority, the chaotic god force behind the mask, was intervening directly to reclaim its property. Akaza stepped between the humans and the god. He was fading fast. The toon energy that had sustained his existence in this weird reality was gone. He was crumbling into dust, just as a demon should when the sun rises. And the sun was rising. The real sun. The morning light was cresting the horizon, pale and white and true. "You are loud," Akaza said to the big head. "And you have no technique." Akaza didn't punch. He didn't use a blood art. He simply stood there, a being of martial discipline, refusing to be impressed by the spectacle. He exerted his will. In the face of a reality warper, the ultimate defense is simply refusing to believe in the lie. "I acknowledge the sun," Akaza whispered, looking at the dawn. "I do not acknowledge you." The rejection was absolute. The big head faltered. It needed an audience. It needed reaction. Akaza gave it nothing. The green smoke wavered, hissed, and was sucked back into the wooden mask. The mask shuddered once, then went inert. A simple piece of wood. Akaza looked back at Tanjiro and Giyu. He smiled. It was a genuine smile, devoid of malice. "A good fight," he said. "Messy, but good." The sunlight hit him. Akaza dissolved into ash, carried away by the wind of the real world. The city around them was falling apart. The paper buildings disintegrated. The neon magma cooled into grey rock. The reality was settling. But it did not snap back to the Taisho era. The fusion had been too deep. The skyline of Tokyo was forever altered. There were still skyscrapers, but they were ruins of brick and steel, overgrown with wisteria vines. The technology level had jumped forward 50 years. A diesel-punk amalgamation of 1920s Japan and 1990s comic book grit. Tanjiro lay on the floor, holding Nezuko's hand. Giyu stood over them, the mask at his feet. He picked it up. It felt heavy, cold. He looked at the void where the red sun had been. "Is it over?" Tanjiro whispered. The show is over, Giyu said. Now we have to live in the studio. The world that remained was a scar. The demons were gone, burned away by the red sun, or erased by the reversion. But the humans were changed. They remembered the madness. They remembered flying. They remembered being safe. And now they had to relearn how to be vulnerable. The human cost was a collective trauma of paradise lost. In the aftermath, the Demon Slayer Corps was disbanded. There were no demons left to slay, but a new organization rose. The Bureau of Normalcy. Their job was to hunt down the remnants of the Toon Force, the stray animated objects, the pockets of distorted gravity, the living ink that still pooled in the sewers. Tanjiro Kamado retired. He had saved his sister, but she was not human, and she was not a demon. She was something new, a child of the crossover, possessing a spark of the chaotic vitality that could heal or destroy. They moved to the mountains, to a house that sat on a cliff overlooking the ruins of the Sun Tower. Tamayo took the mask. She sealed it in a vault made of scarlet iron sand and wisteria wood, buried deeper than the Infinity Castle ever was. She wrote a warning on the door, not a spell, but a simple instruction. Do not open. Genre incompatible. But in the dark of the vault, in the silence of the earth, the mask did not sleep. It waited, and on the wood, a hairline fracture remained. And if you listened very closely, you could hear a sound coming from the object. Not a heartbeat, not a breath, a drum roll. The universe had survived, but the wall between realities was thin. The what-if had become a what-is, and in the shadow of the new skyscrapers, a green feather floated down from the sky, landing in the mud. The archives of the Bureau of Normalcy referred to the period following the Asakusa convergence as the Green Interval, a 3-year gap in Japanese history, where the laws of causality were temporarily suspended. Historians attempting to study the primary sources from this era frequently suffer from migraines, hallucinations, and a persistent sensation of hearing phantom laughter. The geographical scars of the event remain the most visible evidence of the collision. The district of Asakusa was never rebuilt. It was quarantined behind a perimeter of wisteria-infused concrete, designated as a zone of non-Euclidean geometry, where gravity fluctuates randomly and shadows occasionally detach from their owners to perform independent pantomimes. The surviving population of Tokyo carries a collective psychological trauma known as slapstick fatigue. The sound of balloon popping can incite mass panic, and the sight of a brightly colored suit is grounds for immediate arrest by the civil authorities. The eradication of the demon species, once the primary objective of the Demon Slayer Corps, is viewed not as a victory, but as an ecological collapse caused by an invasive metaphysical predator. Muzan Kibutsuji is not remembered as a terrifying tyrant, but as the first victim of a power that recognized no hierarchy. The few demons that survived the initial purge of the Red Sun were hunted down not by swordsmen, but by specialized containment teams armed with solvents and erasers. These remnants, stripped of their biological dignity, exist as pathetic, ink-stained wretches in government facilities, studied for their resistance to the narrative corrosion that nearly consumed the world. The Demon Slayer Corps itself was dissolved, its breathing techniques deemed too dangerous to practice in a world where belief can inadvertently reshape reality. The katana was replaced by the calculator, as the new order prioritized stability and predictability above all else. Tanjiro Kamado resides in a secluded compound in the mountains, far from the modernized, diesel-choked streets of the capital. He's rarely seen. Those who have glimpsed him report that he bears scarring around his temples and jawline, marks that resemble the grain of ancient wood fused with flesh. He does not smile. The muscles required to form a smile were exhausted during his tenure as the solar avatar, leaving his expression permanently fixed in a mask of stoic neutrality. He spends his days tending to a garden of grey flowers that do not bloom, guarding his sister, whose physiology remains a medical impossibility, a being of flesh and fire who cast no shadow. They are the keepers of the memory, the living testaments to the time when the genre broke. Deep beneath the ruins of the Butterfly Mansion, in a vault lined with lead and inscribed with prayer seals from 3 different religions, the wooden object rests. It is clamped within a vice of scarlet iron sand, bathed in total darkness. There are no guards, for no human mind is trusted to stand near it for long. Sensors monitoring the chamber occasionally pick up vibrations that defy seismic explanation. These vibrations do not match the frequency of an earthquake. They match the rhythm of a finger tapping on a hard surface, impatient and rhythmic. The mask is not dormant. It is waiting for the next plot twist, for the moment when the world becomes too serious, too rigid, and too safe. It waits for the inevitable desire for chaos to rise again, knowing that as long as humanity dreams of escaping consequences, the door to the green interval remains unlocked, ready to turn the page on a reality that can no longer distinguish between a tragedy and a joke.